Hello, my name is Ron Moman. I'm a sergeant with the Sandy Springs Police Department. I'll be talking to you today about primary aggressor identification in domestic violence situations. Good investigative strategy to determine who the primary physical aggressor in a family violence situation by officers on scene is critical for protecting victims of domestic violence and holding their abusers accountable. No one else in the criminal justice system is as qualified to make that decision as the first responding officer. Evidence will disappear, and even more critical on the family violence calls, stories may change. The officer who is on scene, while emotions are high and evidence is fresh, will have the most truthful assessment of what really happened and who was involved. Men and women use violence in relationships very differently and for different reasons. Officers often encounter situations where it appears that both the man and the woman have used violence equally. In many family violence situations, physical violence has been used in some way by both parties. However, this does not usually equate to mutual combat. There are differences in the reasons why many men and women use violence in their relationships. Many women who kill their abusive partner are victims of long-term abuse. Many men who kill their female partners do so in the course of the victim's attempt to separate from the relationship. Male homicide of female partners is usually about control, not self-defense or anger, while female homicide of male partners is usually in response to violence perpetrated against them. Officers frequently respond to calls where women have used violence during the incident. Women in violent relationships must decide the most appropriate survival tactic based upon their own personal realities of their situation. Some women will never reach out to any system for intervention, but will suffer their abuse in silence. Some women are able to simply leave the relationship and escape the abuser. Other women will stay and fight back, either physically and or through the use of outside intervention. If both parties have used violence in some way, it certainly does make both parties primary physical aggressors, but does make the assessment of who is the primary physical aggressor of the violence more difficult. One of the first factors is whether one party was using violence in defense of themselves or another party. Abusers often present themselves as the victim or as having used violence in defense of themselves. Careful investigation of injuries, as well as other evidence on scene, is essential to determining whether one of the parties may have used violence in self-defense. Arresting both parties as primary aggressors in the incident is almost never the correct course of action. Arrest of both parties should typically account for less than 5% of family violence arrests. Retaliatory violence is one case in which investigation may reveal that both parties have indeed used violence, and arrest of both parties may be warranted. The Georgia statute clearly states that both parties need not be arrested if the officer can determine a primary physical aggressor, even if the officer believes the other party may have committed an act of family violence during the incident. OCGA 16321 clearly defines the right of a person to defend him or herself or others against imminent unlawful assault. In other words, they do not have to wait to be assaulted before acting. Officers may respond to an incident where the victim has actually repelled the assault by preemptive action. The totality of the situation may be considered before assuming that she or he has acted as the primary physical aggressor. Many times the offender may have the worst injuries. The physical injuries must be assessed by the responding officer against the testimonial evidence to determine whether or not the person acted in self-defense. Prior history of abuse in the relationship is a critical piece of this investigation. There are often drastically opposite stories on domestic incidents, especially when both parties have used violence. It is important to let the evidence speak. Assessment of injury location, type, and severity may be far more important than what the officer is being told. This is where the officer has to let the evidence do the talking. The key elements of a legal defense for self-defense must establish a legitimate threat coupled with an appropriate response. It is very common to encounter abusers who invoke the argument that I was only defending myself. She attacked me. Close examinations of the physical evidence, as well as the establishment of history of violence within a relationship, are critical in the investigation. One key observation by the responding officer has to be that the person may only use the level or amount of violence necessary to stop the threat or infliction of injury. OCGA 17420.1 subsection B is clear that the officer must interview each party separately to determine the primary aggressor. Georgia is not a mandate arrest state with regard to family violence incidents. Officers are required to investigate any allegation of family violence. Where there are opposing stories, and there always will be, the officer is required to attempt to identify the primary physical aggressor. The statute is clear in allowing the officer the ability to arrest one party even if both parties have used violence. For many years, dual arrest was the law enforcement response to family violence incidents where both parties used violence. It is very uncommon to respond to incidents where a man and a woman have engaged in consensual mutual combat. Not impossible, but rare. Appropriately identifying the primary physical aggressor and charging that person accordingly is the most effective intervention in family violence incidents. Many officers hold to the belief that primary only means first. In this statute, primary refers to the main or predominant aggressor. All evidence must be considered before making a determination. Simply striking, slapping, or pushing first does not automatically make that person the primary physical aggressor. One party may initiate the contact and then be seriously assaulted by the other. Once a person exceeds the force necessary to stop the infliction or further injury, self-defense may no longer be claimed. In cases where both parties use violence, if the officer can determine that one party is the primary physical aggressor, then the arrest of both parties is not appropriate. Many different factors must be considered for the assessment of who is the primary physical aggressor. One important thing to note is that domestic violence is typically a pattern of behavior. Rarely would an officer respond to the first incident of violence. Investigation of the totality of the relationship is a key tool in determining the primary aggressor. Domestic violence is a crime of progression and a crime which is repetitive in nature. In a relationship where one party has used violence and intimidation, there exists a pre-established threat level. In other words, a victim may respond physically to what they perceive as an impending assault. The investigating officer must consider the actions with regard to the totality of the relationship. Assessment of physical size and strength must be considered. The officer should pay close attention to the demeanor of each person, not only how they respond to each other, but how they respond and react to the officers. Officers should also observe the children's demeanor as well. If a weapon is used, the officer must determine if the weapon was used offensively or defensively. Defensive weapons tend to be weapons of convenience and should be something that is accessible at the location of the incident. In cases where both parties have injuries, the injuries themselves may give a much more truthful account of the incident than the testimony. Let the evidence talk. Officers should be aware of these areas, such as in the hairline, on the ears, and anywhere that would not be readily seen when the victim is clothed. Investigating officers need to ask victims if they hurt anywhere else or remember being struck anywhere other than the visible injuries. A good comprehensive assessment of these hidden injuries may provide the necessary evidence to build a good case, even if the victim later recants. Certain injuries occur only in certain ways. Defensive injuries will manifest on the victim as bruises, scrapes, swelling, and redness. When these injuries are located on the face, forearms, arms, chest, back of legs, small of back, or head, the officer should consider these as defensive. Scratch marks to the victim's neck are often indicative of strangulation, especially if accompanied by red eyes, petechiae, difficulty swallowing or breathing, or difficulty speaking. It is not uncommon for victims to curl up in a fetal position during an assault. The assault may result in kicks to the legs, buttocks, arms, or head. Victims may have abrasions from the tread of a shoe or boot. Injuries on the suspect may provide the investigator with the clearest picture of the incident. Victims may use their nails and teeth to defend themselves. Defensive scratches will be very location specific. The scratches will typically start as a nail dig and taper off as a scratch mark. It is important to emphasize that nail digs of this nature are virtually always close proximity defensive injuries. The scratches will most commonly be to the chest, face, shoulders, and upper arms of the suspect. A fingernail dig between the thumb and forefinger is often indicative of strangulation, especially if accompanied by scratch marks to the victim's neck. No matter what the story is, no one can run across the room and dig their nails into their partner. Victims may also bite their attacker in self-defense. Defensive bite marks tend to be very location specific, and bite marks to these areas are very rare as offensive bites. If a victim uses her teeth to defend herself, the suspect may have bite marks to the chest, face, bicep area, forearm, groin area, or the inside of the hand. Bite marks to these areas are close proximity defensive injuries. Human teeth are incredibly ineffective as offensive weapons due to the inability to project beyond the plane of the face. So once again, no matter what the story is, no one runs across the room, jumps up and sinks their teeth into another person. Human teeth may be effective defensive weapons in very close quarters, such as a victim being restrained by a forearm around her neck. It is important to note that some sexual offenders and some child abusers do bite offensively. Weapons may be used offensively or defensively. If the allegation is that the weapon or object was used in self-defense, the availability of the weapon to the incident location must be considered. If the assault occurs in the kitchen, a defensive weapon of choice might be a knife or glassware. If the assault occurs in the living room, a lamp or decorative object of some sort might be used. The weapon should fit the location. The manner in which the weapon is used and the locations of the injuries are key elements in establishing the defensive nature of the response. Questions to consider when investigating the use of a weapon include: was the object readily accessible to the alleged victim at the incident location? Was the manner in which the weapon was used? Did the alleged victim continue to use the weapon after the threat was stopped? Abusers are masters of manipulation. They will often express sadness or regret for the victim's situation. They may be concerned that the victim is a substance abuser, crazy, possibly even bipolar, and off their medication. They may present themselves as the innocent victim who is only trying to help the drug or alcohol addicted victim. At the minimum, abusers will try to minimize the incident, even apologizing to the officer for having to come out for such a silly thing. The abuser will try to get sympathy from the officer by pointing out all the faults of the victim while steering the officer away from the evidence. The primary aggressor seldom takes ownership of their role in the violence. One good clue that a person is the primary aggressor is that they are always concerned about finding out what the other person had to say. Abusers may be the first to claim provocation or self-defense as a reason for their violence. Victims may minimize or deny the incident in an effort to protect the abuser. If the victim has used violence in the incident, they may take ownership of and responsibility for it. Many times the victim apologizes for their use of violence. They may say things like, "It wasn't his fault, I should not have," or "He didn't really mean to do it, it was my fault," or that it was just a little argument. Primary aggressor identification is important because the consequences of arresting victims of domestic violence are many. If arrested, the victim would probably be disqualified for crime victims' compensation funds, public assistance, and emergency shelter. All of these are needed to leave a batterer permanently. An arrest of the victim further traumatizes any children involved and sends the message that the police don't help victims. Victims may learn that it is never okay to defend yourself against an attack. The batterer may have told the victim if they call the police, they will tell them that she hit him too. An inappropriate arrest reinforces this threat and may guarantee that the victim will not call law enforcement again. Identification of the primary physical aggressor is often the most difficult task faced by officers on family violence incidents. OCGA 17420 details the steps and requirements of this investigation. Dual arrests should represent a very low percentage of arrest determinations on family violence incidents. Remember, Georgia law does not require the arrest of both parties if a primary physical aggressor can be identified.